Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. Most of you would now be aware that in the Witcher series, the lead star playing Geralt, Henry Cavill, has moved on. He will appear in season 3 to be released soon, but will not be returning for season 4. He's been recast and replaced by Liam Hemsworth. The overwhelming majority of people out there see this as a massive downgrade. No disrespect to Liam Hemsworth himself. However, Henry Cavill, of course, is a super fan of the Witcher series, a big fan of the books and of the games. He also is an A-grade actor, very much, at the peak of his career. Now, ostensibly, he has left in order to reprise his role as Superman, but very few people, myself included, accept that explanation. Henry Cavill turned this as a passion project for The Witcher. He wanted to do a full 7 seasons and committed to doing so under one condition, which was that the books and the games would be represented properly in a faithful adaptation in this television show. Now, there is a video that I published back in January of this year after season 2 was released, which I debated Lauren S. Hissrich, the showrunner of the Witcher series. That sort of debate went back and forth, went on Twitter, and my video was kind of my deep thoughts on where I thought the show had gone terribly wrong. I will leave a link to that video in the description. I thoroughly recommend it because I stand by everything that I said in that video. And I think it's had a huge impact on Henry, not the video itself, but the things I talk about had a huge impact on Henry Cavill leaving the series. And that's because instead of having a faithful adaptation of Andrzej Sapkowski's work, the showrunners have pushed certainly an ideological agenda, politely put through as kind of diversity and inclusion and representation, but in actual fact, totally undermining the themes, the Slavic identity, and the character of Geralt himself in promoting this ideological agenda. But more importantly, undermining the story itself. It's very hard to follow the show because people have been artificially recast. The different faiths and religions make no sense at all. And if you're just a casual viewer, not someone who's read the books and played the games, but just watching the show, it's very hard to become invested when you don't know the difference between Nilfgaard and Skellige and Sintra, or the different religions like the Great Sun or the Skellige Pantheon. You couldn't possibly tell just by looking at a character where they're from. It has to be explained to you through exposition because these castings make no sense. All ethnicities, races, groups have all been thrown in together in a melting pot with no rhyme or reason. Now, I have absolutely nothing against diversity per se, but it has to make sense in the context of the story. If we compare that to Game of Thrones, there is a strong parallel between someone's appearance and where they sit in the setting of Westeros. You've got the different 7 kingdoms, and it's very easy to tell who is Dothraki or from Dorne or from Winterfell based upon their mannerisms and customs. And most viewers can, in turn, understand the different religions, the Red God, the Old Gods, the Light of the Seven. It all makes sense because there is a complex and cohesive world building in which you can cast different groups from different backgrounds and tell a range of different stories from a diverse cast. The Netflix Witcher franchise has become universally hated. For the casual viewer, it's very hard to follow the story. The season 1, of course, jumped through different chronologies and timelines, and it wasn't at all clear that they were in different timelines until quite late in the season. And for those that are passionate about The Witcher, who know the source material, they are equally angry that the adaptation is in no way faithful to the books or to the game. And certainly at the top of that list is Henry Cavill himself, who is playing Geralt. Geralt is a amateur philosopher in the books. He has a lot to say, a lot to think about. He's a deeply complex individual. Whereas in the show, Geralt is sort of relegated to a background character in his own story, facilitating the so-called strong female leads whose show it really is all about. And that's because the showrunners have preferred to focus on those characters. Now, that's not to say that is a terrible thing in terms of elevating the female characters. They are prominent in the books. However, Geralt himself is the main draw for most viewers, both those who are casual viewers who like Henry Cavill and those who are passionate about the books because you see a lot of what's going on in Geralt's own head and the complex conversations that he is having with those around him. Now, there is a change.org petition to replace the writers and instead keep Henry Cavill, and I know I'm pronouncing Cavill and Cavill interchangeably. I actually don't know what the right pronunciation is, so someone can leave a comment down below and correct me, but I'm just going to use both. There's a change.org petition to bring back Henry Cavill as the lead and instead replace the writers with people who are actually passionate about The Witcher and are experienced at translating Slavic material. Now, that petition, you might think, might have a few thousand, signatures from disgruntled fanboys. No, this change petition at the time of this recording is approaching 250,000 signatures. This is for a television show that's only run a few seasons, asking that a specific actor be brought back to the show and ditching everybody else. That is an extraordinary backlash. But this video is going to be a bit of a black pill because I'm going to explain why I think Netflix isn't going to care about that and is going to stick with its terrible strategy no matter what, based upon I think a short-sighted belief that will ultimately fail, but of course is going to cost not only Netflix a lot of money, but also the fans its beloved franchise. So there have been a bunch of other videos talking about Henry's departure and the real reasons why. I think it is perfectly obvious at this point. It has nothing to do with his scheduling demands of playing Superman or anything else. And the main evidence for that is, first of all, he did commit to 7 full seasons, provided there was a faithful adaptation. Secondly, he would have come up publicly and denounced this claim by now. I mean, if you think about the extraordinary harm that this kind of publicity is doing to Netflix's Witcher, if it was a scheduling thing, if it had nothing to do with Henry Cavill's personal views on the way the show was going, then he would have come out publicly and said, no, it's just because I've been offered a bucket of money to play Superman and Superman's an iconic character and that, it was irreconcilable, the shooting schedules and things. He would have made that perfectly clear, but he is kept totally silent. And that speaks volumes. He would, help Netflix out if it wasn't the truth. It clearly is the truth. Now, he's not going to come out himself and denounce the showrunners. He's a professional. He's an A-list actor. He doesn't need to do that. There's plenty of other people who are out there making the case for him, including myself. But that is certainly his perspective, as it is, I would say, the majority of other people. But what you wouldn't have heard out there is why Netflix is going to stay the course no matter what. And part of it is ideological. Of course, many people who are working on the Netflix show, but also within the Netflix organization itself, adopt this sort of racialized woke ideology and seek to evangelize it through all of its productions, and certainly not just through The Witcher, but through a variety of other franchises as well. So that's part of it. But on a more fundamental business level, there is a prevailing theory that what you want to do is fast food your franchises, to turn it into McDonald's and KFC, other types of, very low budget, low quality, but easily digestible and easily anticipated products, and proliferate them as widely as possible. And so what they've done, they've adopted this Witcher franchise. They've done a big flashy release with an A-grade actor, but now what they want to do is diversify that into prequels and sequels and spin-offs, feature films, and other types of shows and productions in order to create an easily digestible product that can be splashed across the platform and just pump out cheap content to stave off subscription cancellations. And so if you think of what's happened to other major franchises with other businesses. So Star Wars, Marvel, they've all turned into these disparate products of hundreds, dozens of shows and productions, all with no-name actors and people at the end of their careers, with writing that is terrible and production that's poor, with messaging that makes no sense, in order to basically just get people to consume the next product. So as long as there is a constant drip of various products with the same branding splashed across it, with an underlying idea that there's some kind of grand story narrative that's tying it all together, sort of Avengers style, the theory is that people will allow their subscriptions to continue to tick over. If you think about the way the streaming model works, there is now a proliferation of different streaming platforms. They all compete with one another. Some people have them all tied up in a bundle and they just keep pumping out the money each time. But most consumers will prioritize. They might have their Amazon Prime and their Netflix or their Disney Plus and Hulu, but they won't have them all, and they'll often jump between them. And if they see a series from start to finish, they will binge it through and often cancel after the 1 month. So if you think about what happened with Netflix and Stranger Things, in the last season, they split it into 2 groups. So you had the first bunch of episodes, and then the last bunch of episodes came out a month later, meaning that people had to allow their subscriptions to tick over in order to continue watching the series. They couldn't binge it all in one go. And Netflix is kind of trying to calibrate that to maximize the retention of different subscriptions and minimize the attrition. And they think, in this case wrongly, but the broad brush theory is that if they have a generic world that can compete with Westeros for House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, or compete with Rings of Power, Tolkien's Middle-earth, and The Witcher is supposedly their answer to it, they don't need Geralt to be there permanently. What they do is they just set up the world and then allow different spin-offs and products to be produced, and that will keep people engaged once they've bought into the world of The Witcher. Now, as I said, in this case, it's going to be a failure. First of all, because the fan base is quite segmented. If you think of Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien, that is a cultural phenomena. One could argue legitimately that Tolkien's vision, his literary contribution, had an actual impact on Western culture, English culture in particular, creating for the English-speaking peoples its own mythology. George R.R. Martin, likewise, in the creation of Westeros, basically took core elements of British history, so the Wars of the Roses, Hadrian's Wall in the north, all of these things, and just accentuated them to fantastical degrees, interspersed a little bit of magic, not much, and other fictional ideas, and that allowed people on a kind of visceral, instinctive level to understand the world of Westeros, because it wasn't that far different from the way in which our actual history has evolved. Compare that with The Witcher, which is specifically a Slavic mythology that most English-speaking people won't have an immediate connection to and need to be taught. Now, it is fascinating and it is extraordinarily interesting, which is why it gripped so many millions of people. But you have to set these things up in a much more methodical way. It doesn't have the benefit of instinctively knowing the way feudal societies work within, Westeros, or the way in which the different kingdoms interrelate in Middle-earth, because it's been reproduced over many, many decades. This is something that is kind of new for people to understand. Secondly, the fan base for The Witcher is highly segmented towards a particular group. While J.R.R. Tolkien is everybody, The Witcher has only really been accessed by young men, because although many people have read the books, many millions more have played the video games. And those video games, of course, are consumed primarily by young men. So the Witcher franchise needs to appeal specifically to young men, which isn't the target audience of what the showrunners have created. You won't actually get a pre-existing fan base engaged without that connection. And in order to do that, you need to focus much more on the character Geralt, his philosophy, his challenges and outlook, goals, problems, conflict, and so forth, and to create the world through his perspective. This is not something that the showrunners have done at all. They've focused very much on the female characters and done so in a pretty chaotic way by, as I say, recasting various different characters and groups, making it extremely difficult for a casual viewer to buy into the world, the northern hemisphere of the Witcher world. Now compare that to Westeros. Imagine if the casual viewer had no orientation. Not only has the world been constructed extremely effectively, but the Starks relate on an instinctive level to the Scots, and the Lannisters relate to the Lancastrians of the Wars of the Roses. You've got the Yorkists. All these things relate to the great houses of medieval England in particular, but also Europe. You don't have that with The Witcher. If you see a character on screen, you have no connection. Everything you see has to be explained to you, and preferably it would be show, don't tell. You can actually communicate this Slavic world, which is already well written and produced by Sapkowski, through showing people the different interactions. And to a degree, they do that with the mages. It's clear that the mages have some kind of advisory role with the great leaders, that the mages themselves create companions for rulers and place them in different parts of the chessboard. But beyond that, it's very hard to understand what the relationship between Nilfgaard and Sintra is, or Skellige, or any of the other groups, the elves, the different types of elves. In the kaleidoscope of the fantasy genre, The Witcher, as the showrunners have produced it, is essentially throwing something at the dartboard and seeing what sticks without actually adapting the pre-existing world and building upon it, which is what's going to prevent it from becoming the sort of spin-off franchise. Now, we've already seen the first spin-off miniseries that's being released shortly, a prequel, of course. And if you see the trailer for that, it's just a catastrophe. Once again, a total mismatch of different groups and identities and cultures that have no relation to the Witcher world, remembering that this is a Polish Slavic mythology that we are exploring. And the enthusiasm and anticipation for it is non-existent. In fact, the trailer has on YouTube some 39,000 upvotes and 140,000, 150,000 downvotes. People are actively disengaged with the Witcher series. I'm seeing it panned in various communities and various commentaries across the internet from different walks of life. People that are big fans of the source material, people that are just casual watchers but deeply engaged with the sort of politics of what's going on in Hollywood these days. So we're not going to see The Witcher revived, because even by the standards of their own objective, which is to create a readily consumable product that isn't of super high quality, but something that people can rely upon, just like the fries you get at McDonald's are not high quality, but you can rely upon them wherever you are in the world. Well, that's what the streaming services are attempting to deliver, but they haven't done even the most basic work of getting The Witcher to that level, to such a degree that they can spin it off in a way that people will reluctantly consume it. First of all, you don't have the core audience, which are those young men who know about The Witcher. You don't have their infectious enthusiasm bringing other groups into the fold, and you don't have the orientation of the world of The Witcher for the casual viewer, which in no way translates the source material to a broader audience. You can argue that Game of Thrones had a massive advantage because the author himself was an experienced screenwriter. He was deeply engaged in the production of the material. He was deeply engaged with Dan and Dave. And without question, the best seasons of Game of Thrones, what made it breakthrough television, a global phenomena, was when Dan and Dave was translating specifically what George R.R. Martin had written to the screen. But once Dan and Dave outran the books, because George R.R. Martin's such a slow writer, then the whole show fell off a cliff, culminating in the catastrophic season 8. But the writing was already on the wall. From season 5 onwards, the show went down markedly in quality because all they had were loose beats for the way the show was supposed to go, not the rich material that they could draw from George R.R. Martin's extensive writing. Now, in the case of The Witcher, they actively denigrate the source material and decide to take it in a new direction. They don't like the fans. They don't like the source material. There are many things about The Witcher that these evangelists believe need to be updated for modern audiences, so-called. Now, the excuse that Lauren Hissrich has used is that she wants to appeal to many millions of people outside of the core segment. What she doesn't realize is that the vast majority of people out there don't care about this diversity agenda. What they care about is having good characters that are well drawn, that make sense, and that everybody can relate to because the story has universal narrative. In the case of The Witcher specifically, Geralt is faced with significant moral dilemmas. And one of the things that the show could do, the way the Witcher world could fit into the broader kind of kaleidoscope of fantasy series, is to ask very complicated questions of the audience, but specifically in the context of the show, leaving that their own political suppositions at the door. So, for example, is Nilfgaard a evil totalitarian empire that just seeks to conquer everyone? Well, from some perspectives, that would be the case, but from other perspectives, it would be just an organization that is following a particular belief system, seeking to bring order to an otherwise dangerous and chaotic world. Alternately, are the humans encroaching on traditional elven lands and forcing them to the outskirts of society? Or are the elves in their bitterness and historical revisionism actually justifying heinous acts against the human race because they believe the humans have done terrible things to them in the past and they need reparation? These and many other concepts we could delve into using the Witcher world in a very sophisticated way, in a way that was aligned with the way the books are written and the games have been produced. Also, Geralt himself faces these dilemmas with one foot in every door. He's part human, he's part monster, he's part magic, and he can see things from every different perspective while not actually belonging to any particular group. And that is, without question, what makes him such an interesting protagonist, and in the case of the showrunners, a wasted protagonist. So I think the backlash against the show is entirely justified. It's extremely poorly written, poorly produced, appeals to nobody, and does little more than evangelize a failed ideology, imposing it upon the viewing public. And regardless of your ethnic background, whether you're from India or Japan, this is entirely unwelcome because you have to be introduced to the world of the Witcher in the Slavic mythology and the Slavic traditions in order to identify with what's actually happening. And we see that with other shows that have relatively homogenous ethnic groups. We see Squid Game, we see Kingdoms, other shows, set in Asia. We don't have the same ideological diversity agenda, and that exposes the lack of sophistication of the showrunners, because from the perspective of Europeans, there is a lot of differences between Polish people and English people, for example. In England, it's very hard for them to identify with people from Greece or Italy or the former Yugoslavia. And when it comes to the Slavic traditions, they're probably equally ignorant as to the Americans. But because the Americans have a racialized worldview where representation doesn't mean diversity of culture and ideas purely of skin color, they see diversity as being a diversity of racial groups, not a diversity of perspectives, which The Witcher could legitimately introduce. So I think The Witcher is in terminal decline. We won't see a revival. I think the departure of Henry Cavill is a major nail in the coffin of this series, and a real missed opportunity, because when we talk about representation, when we talk about diversity, well, the Slavs deserve to have their mythology represented to a broader viewing audience because it enriches all of our culture by having its inclusion. Just as English culture has been adapted faithfully by Peter Jackson and brought J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth to the big screen, and just as George R.R. Martin has adapted medieval English history for a broad viewing audience using the analogies of Westeros and House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, well, that has actually brought an anglicized philosophy to the entire world that perhaps from a perspective that most people hadn't previously seen, and the actual casting choices are somewhat irrelevant to that. So in an effort to be inclusive, the showrunners have actually been exclusive. They haven't included the Slavic mythology that is so important for people to understand what the Witcher franchise is all about. And so in this particular case, it will be a failure. They won't be able to produce successful spin-offs from it because they don't have a cultivated core fan base that even understands what is actually being shown to them on the screen. All they have is a group of angry people who don't see the actual source material being adapted. The top of that list, of course, being Henry Cavill himself. So what do you think? Are my predictions of the collapse of the Witcher franchise too pessimistic? Will they be able to replace Henry Cavill with Liam Hemsworth and continue on as Noble? Will these other spin-offs be more successful than I'm predicting? Or do you think that Netflix Witcher has already failed and is basically just a zombie walking until it ultimately gets cancelled? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. If you wish to support us, you can do so on Contribui. Hit a like on this video either way, and check out my previous video on where I debated Lauren Hissrich on The Witcher. I think it extends on these points quite well, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.